Hi, I'm Malcolm. This video is part of a complete Terraform course I have available. The link with the big discount is on the description. Make sure to check that out and let's get started. Hello and welcome back. Let's take the opportunity to practice a bit working with resources, and we're going to build our first a little bit more complex project. What we're going to do is we will define a VPC, a subnet, as well as deploy an EC2 instance inside of this VPC and make the EC2 instance publicly available. There are a few steps for us to implement. So let's create first here. I'm going to create 06-resources. And I'm going to create a new file here. I'm going to say readme.md just for us to write down here steps for implementation. The first one will be to deploy a VPC and a subnet. Then we also want to deploy an internet gateway and associate it with the VPC. We then also want to set up a route table with an entry or with a route to the internet gateway. And then here we can deploy or set up, let's say deploy, it's fine, deploy an EC2 instance inside of the created VPC or inside of the created subnet here. And last but not least, we would like to associate a public IP and a security group that allows public ingress. Okay, so these are the steps that we need to do to deploy an EC2 instance inside of a subnet and then allow public ingress to this EC2 instance. Perfect. So we know what we would like to do. Let's start then with deploying a VPC and a subnet. Since this is a new terminal for me, I'm just going to source the .env file here, which contains my AWS credentials so that I can apply these changes whenever running the Terraform CLI. Let's go with a new file here. I'm going to call this provider.tf and I'm going to set up our Terraform project. The required version of Terraform here I'm going to put, and I'm going to be a little bit more specific now. I'm going to say anything greater than or equal to 1.7.0 and less than 2.0.0. So in case there are any major updates of Terraform, then this will constrain Terraform to stay within the 1.x version, and it will use at least the 1.7.0. Then we also have our required providers, and the one that we need right now is AWS. We're going to say source here, that's going to be HashiCorp/AWS. And the version here will once again be that tilde arrow here 5.0. Perfect. Let's then change into this directory. Let's run the Terraform format command to make sure that the file is looking good, and then we can run Terraform init. Great, so we have Terraform initialized. We can run Terraform version to check all the versions that were installed. I'm still using the 1.7.3, even though there is a slightly newer version here. If you want, you can go ahead and update, it's no problem. And we're also using Terraform 5.38.0. Great, so let's create a new file here. I'm gonna call this VPC, or actually networking, because it will contain more stuff than the VPC. And the first thing I would like to create is a resource AWS_VPC, and this is just going to be called this. So there are two conditions, or not conditions, but there are two schools of thoughts here. One of them names or uses the keyword this, and this has no special meaning, but this is just one convention that is out there. Another convention is that people just repeat the value here, AWS VPC, VPC. When you have more than one AWS VPC, right? So you have two, let's say here, you could use a bit more specific, for example, prod and non-prod, right? So then you can differentiate here between which VPC is actually referring to each of the environments. I strongly discourage you of doing something like this, VPC1 and VPC2, because this contains no information whatsoever about the VPC. You could differentiate them here, right? You could add, for example, an environment, which would be prod, and you would add another tag here of an environment of non-prod. That's also possible. However, you will hardly ever work with this piece of code only. So you will always reference this VPC in multiple places, And then whenever you are looking at code that references this VPC or this VPC, then you always have to come back to the VPC definition to understand what it actually refers to. So terrible practice. Never do it like this. Whenever you have just one resource, then it would be okay to repeat the name or to use the keyword or the word this. You could also use another generic word like main. I prefer main instead of this, and then it's really up to you. So that's more of a convention, and it varies depending on personal preferences. Anyway, so the CIDR block that we will use here, 10.0.0/16, it could be /24, for example, but I'm just gonna go with a slightly broader one. And within this VPC, we would also let's say we're going to add a few tags here. Just going to say managed by, and that's going to be managed by Terraform. And this will help us understand a little bit more whenever we want to filter resources. We can also pass tags to find them. So there's the managed by, and we'll also say project here. And the project, I'm just going to put 06-resources, right? So you can think of the project here as being the folder. If you want to deploy VPCs on other projects and you want to differentiate them, then you can also use a project like this. And you could also add a name here, and this name will be displayed in the UI of AWS. It has to be with a capital N here. So we're going to also say 06 resources VPC, or VPC it's not necessary here because that's clear that it's a VPC. Now we start diving a little bit deeper into how we can actually mark or label our infrastructure as we are creating it with Terraform. And this is definitely good practice, right? So it's always a good practice to add tags. A few other common tags would be like team or environment or cost center, something like this, right? So depending on the project where you are, you always come across useful tags, and I would strongly recommend that you set them on a resource basis for all the resources that support the tags. Also, a little bit later down the road, we're going to see how we can actually set up some default tags, which can be useful whenever we want to tag all our resources. And then we will see a couple of strategies as well that we can use to both provide default tags as well as merge default tags with our own custom tags. That comes a little bit later down the road. Right now, let's focus on the project at hand. And now we would like to create an AWS subnet. And this will also be just main, or we could also even say public, right? So normally you have more than one subnet. For us, we're going to create just one subnet here. So you would have maybe a public and private, or two publics and two private subnets. It depends. Here, we're going to just create one, but just to make sure or to make it clear that this is a public subnet, we're going to label it as public. VPC ID here is going to be our AWS VPC main.id. And the CIDR block is going to be just 10.0.0.0/24. Great. We can also copy here the tags, right? So we can copy these tags here and paste it here. The name is going to be 06 resources public, and the project is going to be 06 resources, and the managed by will be also Terraform. So as you can see here, we start having some duplication. So to have some common tags would actually be very useful. Great. Let's keep the infrastructure for this as this much for this video, since we also discussed a few other things. Let's run a format, and now everything is looking good. So let's run a plan, Terraform plan, and let's see the changes that will be implemented. And as you can see, I forgot to configure our provider. So let's come here in our provider.tf. I'm just going to say provider AWS, and the region here is going to be EU West 1, right? So, or whatever region you are working with. So let's see if now the plan will be successful. Perfect. That's no problem. We will see that we have a couple of resources here that will be created. That's great. So let's now clean the page and run a Terraform apply. We will confirm with yes, and then we're going to switch quickly to the console. Once this has completed, we're going to switch to the console to inspect the resources that were created. Great. So I'm within the VPC page. If you want to come to this page and you're not sure how, you can just type VPC on the top and click on the first option that appears here. Let's click on VPC. And as you can see, we have 3 VPCs here. This is the default VPC. This is a legacy VPC that I created in a previous section of the course. And we have our 06 resources. So very useful here to know, to provide a name, to know what this VPC refers to. Once we click here on this VPC, then we can see that we have at the bottom here a very nice resource map. This shows the VPC as well as the subnet, as well as the route tables, right? And then here we have no network connections or no connections to other networks. And this route table here is the default route table that is created with a VPC in case there are no other route tables. Or actually, this will always be created with the VPC. What is an implicit association here is the association between our subnet and this route table. And that's because we have not created any specific route table and made any explicit subnet association, right? So we have our 06 resources public here. If we click here, we will see that when we expand, we get our CIDR block. And if we were to click on this arrow here, then we are taken to this subnet page. And we have here a lot of information. So if we scroll down a little bit, we should see on the tags here, all the tags that we have provided, right? So that's great. We are now able to identify our resources a little bit better. We can also, if we were to click on the subnets page, we can filter by an attribute or a tag. So if we were to write project here, you will see the project equal, and then we can say here 06 resources, and this is going to show only the subnets that are referring to our current project. Right, so that's great. Let's take a short break now because I believe we have discussed a few topics, and let's come back in the next lecture when we continue with the implementation of this little project.